The Spin-off Podcast Network. Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Nau mai, hoki mai ki a The Fold e mihi ne, ko Duncan Greer tōku ingoa. This week, I'm doing something a bit different. I had plans, big plans, to talk about the state of the live music industry, and we're just throwing them all away because yesterday, as I record this, a little less than 24 hours ago, our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, announced a resignation in very shocking and unexpected terms. And you know, obviously that's a multi-dimensional news event. It's always quite galvanizing in a newsroom when something like that happens, as you sort of process all of the different ways it impacts the country. But on The Fold, I talk about the media, obviously, and I wanted to have a conversation about Jacinda Ardern and the media, because I've written about this at various times over the years. I think, you know, my theory is that she was maybe the greatest communicator of her age anywhere, and that, you know, to understand her and to appreciate her, you kind of have to keep that in mind. And I think for the media to have someone who is so adept and had to do so much communicating, that was just quite a different kind of situation. So what I'm going to do is I've got Toby Manhire, who was our editor for most of her period as Prime Minister and host of Gone by Lunchtime, one of the best, most cerebral political analysts we have, and also someone who worked for The Guardian for many years, so has seen multiple different, very prominent leaders up close. But I'm also getting his successor as editor, Madeline Chapman, who, you know, a brilliant writer and deep thinker, but also someone who literally wrote the book on Jacinda Ardern. And so I think that they both have really different and interesting perspectives to share on this kind of relationship between Ardern and the media. And I guess I want to, just before we get into that, just to kind of talk about my own kind of perspective on all this, which I've written up into a sort of a little essay that will be on the spin-off by the time this runs. I mean, there was this whole theory of Jacinda Ardern that existed before, well, while she was an MP, but before she was in any kind of leadership position within Labour. She was quite prominent from the start. She was always good at media. You know, her and Simon Bridges, when they were, I think, in their 20s or early 30s, were both on breakfast and had a good little thing going. You would see her at events. Like she was into the same kind of cultural stuff as a lot of the journalists of my generation. Were almost the same age, and she was always this like cool MP. She dressed well. She'd show up. You could chat to her. She'd sort of, she was engaged on Twitter and so on. But the theory of her from the kind of the grown-ups in the media, who at that time, the sort of the columnists and editors and the people who sort of advanced a particular thesis of someone, where they thought about her at all, she was known, as Matthew Hooden put it, as a flake. And, I don't think that was, there's a way of viewing that as something that is just sort of gendered and misogynist, and I'm sure that there was something of that in there. But I think in general it was also because she didn't seem like ferociously ambitious and didn't, translate her kind of charisma and so on into something which felt like it was ready for the big stage. So that was the general the line on her, that she was talented, but maybe didn't make the most of that talent, and that just changed for me basically in one night. So she'd been elevated to deputy leader against her will. Madeline Chapman's got a brilliant piece on the spin-off about how she basically never wanted any of this. Really genuinely seemed not to. I sort of buy the theory, but she was deputy leader and she ran to become MP of Mount Albert. Prior to then, she'd always been on the list, and she'd actually lost the Auckland Central electorate battle to Nikki Kay in 2011. So we put on a debate. The spin-off at the time did lots of silly things. We try and still do that now. We put on a debate in a shipping container out the back of an Indian restaurant in Sandringham, and it was her against Jeff Simmons and Julianne Genter, and like they're all pretty good politicians. That they all have a pretty reasonable command of policy. Jacinda Ardern showed up and just scorched, and it was night and day from what she'd been before. And I don't know whether she was put in some kind of, they used to joke that Kobe Bryant got flown to Germany to be given this kind of freaky blood treatment that combated the aging process. It almost felt like she'd done some kind of political, intellectual version of that. She just had total command of the whole of politics, every policy area. She was so articulate. And I was just like, who is she? She predictably kind of cleaned everyone's clocks in the electorate. 6 months later, you had the disastrous poll result. Andrew Little falls on his sword, and suddenly she's leader and Jacinda mania, and all that happens. So look, so that's the kind of the backstory. And, she came from there. So we basically had to deal with the fact that there was this huge kind of almost irrational level of love and interest in her. And basically my theory is she almost never had a normal relationship with the media or public at any point. It was either completely unsustainably just over the top, or, lately there's kind of, completely irrational levels of, her becoming a victor for how just fed up everyone is. And in between times, a whole lot of things went on, and that's basically what I'm going to try and tease out with Mad and Toby here, because this is someone who does have a degree in communications, who has it's absolutely true that they do a lot of research, and that she she thinks very hard about how things look. By the way, that's not unique to her. Every prime minister is really good at media. Every prime minister thinks really hard about how things are going to land. That's the whole of the job. You need to get elected. So, that's not something kind of sinister or that kind of denigrates her in any way at all. But it is something that she was uncommonly good at, and I think it's important to kind of, as we look back on her time as prime minister, try to figure out what it means and how she might be replaced, because she really did also straddle the kind of the true end of the period of primacy for legacy media and the move into this different media era. I'm just going to try and process all that with Toby Manhire and Madeline Chapman here on The Fold. Tēnā korua. Madeline, Toby, welcome to The Fold. Thanks for stopping by.
Kia ora.
You're welcome.
This is so weird. Toby, do you buy this thesis that her mastery of communication was the defining characteristic or the most important way of understanding her as a leader?
Yeah, probably. Although I think that is not to be underestimated, insofar as I think sometimes we think about communications as being the same thing as spin, which it really isn't. And there's been a lot of commentary over the last 24 hours about the response to two incredible, unimaginable events, namely the terrorist attacks in Christchurch and the COVID early times, and the ability to communicate successfully in those moments is leadership. It's not communications alone. I mean, she did do a communications degree, I think, at Waikato University. Maybe her biographer, Madeline Chapman, can tell us more about that. But it's I guess I'd say yes, but I don't think we should imagine that is damning her with faint praise.
Yeah, because I agree that I think there's a school of thought that is all she is, or that is kind of immaterial. But if you can't communicate well, you don't get to be Prime Minister at all. And because of what she went through, it was particularly kind of...
And it's clearly not all that she was either. That's the other thing to say, which is a criticism that might be levelled.
And sort of to flow on from that, how you've worked in the UK, you've observed a lot of political leaders in that time. Do you think that the way that she kind of related to media and with that kind of mastery of communications was, as has been, particularly from international media, that there is that understanding of her as being like truly brilliant? There was like a kind of globally significant quality that she had?
Yeah, although I think there's another part to that, which is the compassion or the empathy or, the kindness or whatever you want to call it, which isn't necessarily the same as communication skills. If you look at someone, a lot of leaders, a Clinton or a Blair, absolute masters of communication and pretty good at doing the old having a beer with a voter type thing. I think Jacinda Ardern was different, both domestically, certainly at the outset, and in terms of the way she was perceived internationally, because she did have that empathy. That's a real thing, and I think it was there as well. I don't think it was a performance. I think to a certain extent, someone like Blair could stand accused of performing a level of compassion. I'm not saying it was a fake particularly, but with Jacinda Ardern, that's her in public and in private, or at least that's my experience. When she's pretty hard to get any kind of gossip out of in the green room, in the way that some politicians love that sort of thing. And in some sense, maybe that's what made it harder for her as things went on, was that she was empathetic, which sometimes probably is not that unlike having... People who are empathetic don't necessarily have the thickest of skins, and when you're being targeted by some pretty vituperative, horrible people saying false things about you and your family and threatening your life, then that takes its toll, I think.
Mad, this is like such a hack line, but you did literally write the book on Jacinda Ardern, and the process of that, I think, read or watched basically literally every word in terms of interviews with her. Despite her decline to participate, you still were not short of material. How would you, having done all that, you wrote this piece this morning, which we published this morning, about that, basically saying that you truly believe that she didn't want to be Prime Minister. To what extent do you, when you're reading back or thinking about those interviews, does the Jacinda Ardern that you portrayed in the book match the one that we sort of experienced through her media appearances?
I think that was the thing that I noticed, was that she was almost frustratingly, for someone trying to write a thrilling book about her, extremely consistent, like literally from birth was extremely consistent. And so there didn't seem to be any pivot in her approach to politics all of a sudden, either when she became an MP or when she became deputy leader or when she became leader or when she became Prime Minister. It was all the same, and I think that is where, as Toby said, the empathy and the communication in those big events, it makes sense that those would be where she really thrived, because that is what she kind of was very good at as a person and as a student at high school, and then as a student politician and things like that. That was her strength. And then once you get into the day-to-day and the parts where you have to be basically sacrificing people's needs for other people's needs, and you're ultimately going to piss a lot of people off, and then that's suddenly where things become a bit trickier for someone who is more leaning towards the want everyone to get along and just want to make some nice changes.
Yeah, one thing which, in terms of that sort of prehistory, 'cause she was sort of around. I mean, she lives near here. We would sort of bump into her at the cafe underneath the office periodically. But even before then, she was kind of just, she'd go to the same kind of openings or concerts that you would. And that sort of extended to, she seemed like where a lot of politicians are very interested in the gallery and have almost no interest beyond that. I think that I seem to remember her like following you on social media when you were like maybe an intern or something, and would like maybe even like message you. Like she had this like, and that didn't feel like it was a sort of an attempt to court favour. It was just like she's a person who reads things. Yeah,
it was an almost embarrassing moment where I was asked to write this book in 2019, and I thought, I guess I should follow her on Instagram. And I went to follow her and it said follow back. And I was like, when did she follow me? And I think she followed me because I had made some political meme in the 2017 election campaign. And that was it, and I hadn't even noticed. But it was like, she was just kind of, you look at who she follows. I mean, even now, I don't think she's unfollowed anyone. So when you look at who she follows, there's some kind of, it's a random assortment of like, local comedians who she was familiar with as an Auckland MP in 2010, and then global leaders and, things like that. So it is, and she didn't seem to shift much there. But you're right, I spoke to so many people trying to get anything about her, admittedly anything juicy or a little bit dramatic about her before she became an MP or before she became Prime Minister. And it was like, even the people who knew her were like, no, she's just, she didn't really tell us about her personal life. She was still even then just a little bit aware of what happens when public figures have, a bit chatty. So I think I finally got somebody who flattered with her in 2001 to talk to me, and I thought I got the biggest scoop in the world because I was like, I can't believe I got someone to talk about Jacinda. And then when I bumped into her at the cafe, she was like, oh yeah, I heard you talk to my flatmate. So even then, that person who hasn't spoken to her in, close to 20 years still checked in just to make sure it was all good to have a chat.
They all had to check with Klaus Schwab, the economic forum, and all their handlers. And
that's a Roger Stone reference for those who aren't really, really fucked upedly online. So, I mean, but the reason I pointed out was not just to kind of give you the opportunity to kind of brag about your followers, more about like she has this holistic mastery of media, understands what it's for and how to use it. I think the most prominent example of that was these Facebook Lives that were like massively popular. They were candid enough that they did feel like they were revealing, and it was a way of, people got mad. They thought it was talking around the media, but I think it was also just like that was who she was, and it was a really useful kind of mechanism for her. Do either of you want to just talk about that social media aspect of
I think that's
her?
a really interesting point, and I think she is probably, I don't know if pioneering is overstating it, but she's not alone among leaders around the world in adopting those technologies. And there's probably been theses written about this, but going past the idea that you have a full team that produce your social media and make sure all the angles are right. And if you look a bit like you've got a stain on your T-shirt because your toddler vomited on it, all the better. A sort of move towards authenticity, and she embraced that. And the interesting thing is I think that does start to wear with ordinary people over time. And at some point it doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be authentic and real or confected and designed for political purpose. The two, there can be parts of each column, right? And over COVID, certainly there was a point at which it was incredibly useful for her to do things. She did this pretty much for the duration, where she would come after a big cabinet decision, post-cabinet press conference at which the information would be disseminated via the usual mainstream sources. And then she'd go home and do a Facebook Live and talk to people about it. And that was very useful. The problem with that as well is that you actually start to see some of the, genuinely appalling, venomous comments that come back at you. So there's that, and people organised as things got tighter. But also I do think after a while, and this goes to a broader point, which isn't really your question about the exposure, and the point that's been made quite a lot now, that over the course of 5 years, she probably had about 10 years worth of screen time for reasons that weren't within her control. But in terms of that social media version of leadership, I do think after a period of time, it starts to seem less fresh, original, authentic, and more confected, deliberate, and even sometimes rightly or wrongly cynical.
Mad, she's someone who's been Prime Minister for most of your adult life, and not wanting to make you the voice of a generation or anything, but do you sort of feel like that idea of her, through really no real fault of her own, but because of the kind of combination of Facebook Lives and then the 1PMs and just the general volume of communications, that happens in an era where there is just a lot of that available, that young people who used to be some of her biggest partisans, there's a sense that they're a little, that she's become kind of overexposed, and some of that has kind of dissolved into a kind of apathy about her.
I think maybe. I don't know if it's necessarily a generational thing, because I know that there are still, it's one of those things where you see people when they first get into politics, she is the first person that they like, and she's the first person that they're interested in. And then perhaps as people become way too into politics, then you start to spread and get everyone else in as well. And I think that is essentially she is almost like
she's like she's the gateway.
Yeah, she's the gateway into politics in a very good way. But it also means that potentially then people go, oh, okay, well, I don't need these things explained to me on a Facebook Live. I will read them in a, very seriously written news report.
Or I'll find a more kind of laneway version of a politician to kind of, that's more represents a cooler version of my identity.
Or just have utopian ideas shattered by the reality of politics.
Or that. So I think the interesting thing will be going into this next election that there will be people who have voted more than once who have never had to consider voting for somebody who doesn't feel as accessible or down to earth or, up with the times as everyone else. Although looking at the Labour candidates, they're not actually that far from her in that sense of age and onlineness. But certainly national, having a Prime Minister who doesn't go on Facebook Live in a sweater will be new for many people.
Let's not forget Bill English's walk run though, and other
pizza.
Facebook
he did
triumphs.
That is true.
He had a bad pizza once, right?
He put spaghetti on pizza.
That's right.
But I think that's the thing is he did it and got mocked for it largely, and then Jacinda does very similar things. To be honest, bake a cake, things like that, and that's great and is applauded. So I think that is that key where you can't just go on, be yourself on social media and people will like you, because lots of people don't like lots of people for being themselves.
I don't want to see the real version. I want to see the podium version.
So I think for some politicians, it has opened a new way that there will be new types of leaders. And for others, it'll be this is still not a thing that you should be trying to do because it's not your strength.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because she was our Prime Minister for 5 years, all of the kind of shock of the new that created Jacinda mania sort of fades away, and that's the person who's just there all the time. And so the that novelty element of having a prime minister who dresses cool and like knows things about cultural stuff is it's gone for us. But it might also, depending on who gets elected, you kind of go back to, there's always those things over summer where there's like, what book will you be reading and what's your favourite New Zealand song? And a lot of the time they feel like it's some kind of press handler has kind of put them together, whereas with Jacinda's were actually, seemed real.
But they both were real. But also, as your job starts to include things like, many international summits, dealing with internal ructions and whips, trying to look after large caucuses, your ability to say, frankly, what you're reading over summer, and rather than deputing it to a member of your team, let's be real. I was just reading her 2017 address at the campaign launch, which was this amazing thing, and I think, probably the biggest. I used the word in my write-up of the piece, Beatlemania. And it felt. I can't say I have first-hand experience of Beatlemania, but the Jacinda mania thing sometimes didn't feel like that crazily hyperbolic. The event was in the town hall. There was like impromptu singing. The crowd was so big that they had to fill the other chamber in the town hall, and Q Theatre was also spillover with screens in there. It was insane. And in that speech, there's some stuff that's really quite sweet about, I hope my sister's watching in London, I'm going to check if you are, and all this sort of stuff that just felt so kind of, it just felt so human, and sort of it conveyed some of the sort of amazement and real, like, here's a normal person. And just over time, you can't do that. Over time, the more you kind of pull out, here's some cards for some kids, here's some, even if you're writing your own speeches, you're the fucking prime minister now.
Yeah.
And so that's your life. There's, and the more you try and pull your real life into it to show your realness, the more it seems like it's a contrivance.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Jacinda Mania and its kind of long tail Stardust. God, these names were like quite heinous, but unfortunately they're the shorthand we have to use. It presented a real challenge to cover because you're covering an election where you've got like Bill English, who peaked in terms of the pop cultural zeitgeist with the walk run, with like kind of a pop star. And how do you do that in a way that is sort of equitable and also you can't not cover the phenomenon, but you also have to try and assess them as a politician and do it in 2.5 minutes. Like, to what extent was that kind of supernova glow around her that she had for quite some time a real challenge for particularly the kind of the big show media, the sort of 6 p.m. news and the newspapers, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the Stardust, and that was Bill English's term that he used in one of the debates, I think. And in the book that came out after the election, after every election, Stephen Levine, who's this very cool, smart guy at Victoria University, puts out a book which includes a whole lot of, comes out of a conference, which is people reflect on the election. The name of the book in 2017 was, or 2018 when it would come out, was Stardust and Substance. And I think that kind of was a pretty good title, because the problem with just going with Stardust is that you were accepting what was, I mean, it wasn't heavily pejorative, but it was meant kind of as a light insult, by on the basis of what wasn't there. But there was also substance. What was extraordinary, though, is that, and this, I guess, was the challenge for everyone covering it at the time, was that it was true that the policy platform was unchanged. And the media obviously plays a role in this, but it told you something about the power of a personality, the power of an individual to change things. Because when Andrew Little saw the writing on the wall and talked to Jacinda Ardern, and the change happened, and Mad's written about this in her book beautifully, and talked about in a piece that's on the site now about Jacinda Ardern being a reluctant prime minister. She didn't want to be prime minister. That still, that changed everything, and so how could you not look at the personality? How can you not cover this phenomenon? How can you not focus on a kind of global fascination, absorption in this force of personality? Again, it doesn't have to be the same thing as claiming superficiality.
Agree.
I mean, I think that's the leaders of the parties are obviously the leaders and the figureheads and the spokespeople and the big decision makers. And so there are many hats to wear in that position, and as Prime Minister, obviously, as well. And she just wore the hat of the spokesperson and the personality of the party exceptionally well, in a way that, many Davids before her had failed to do. So it's like, you have to acknowledge, unfortunately, some things are noticed more than others, and, communication and personality is often noticed immediately more than political, I don't know. Nous. I was trying to get the pronunciation of that correct. And I think that's where, it made sense that spike would happen in the first instance, and then would happen again anytime she had those big moments of being, quote unquote, a human on the world stage, and then starts to come down once you get into where actually the personality is not the most important thing. People want to see a policy and how it's going to affect their life and what that means for their family. So, and that's, as a captain of a team, captains of sports teams are not sometimes, but not always, the best player on the team. And that's for a reason, because you don't have to be the best player on the team to be the captain. I think it suggests the different types of candidates that can come as leader and prime minister, when people realise that actually running a country is not one person's job, and potentially if it was all, in her terms, she was extremely successful because a lot of the things she had to do were that the spokesperson and the person delivering the speech who can get everyone on board and be empathetic. And if she had been serving for 6 years where that was not a thing that people cared about as much because of a cost of living crisis or, things like that, then her terms would have looked very different. And now when they're picking a new leader, it's kind of like, well, do you try and get some of that personality again, make that hat bigger, or do you just revert back to who can push through those legislative changes?
I think one of the things to add to that is that, in terms of the sporting analogy of whether or not it's the best player on the team or not, one thing that I think is easy to forget about Jacinda Ardern's qualities is just her immense recall. I think most of us, certainly I, just can't contain that amount of information in my brain. It's not just containing the information, it's finding a way to access it and deliver it in complete sentences while remembering a bunch of other conflicting ideas and facts and pitfalls and fish hooks and and pratfalls. It's just incredible, and I think we sometimes get used to it when we watch politicians, and some are better than others. But both to be able to be that leader, but also to be able to access that information. I mean, I must have interviewed her long form like 6-7 times, sometimes for over an hour, and admittedly, I wasn't normally doing full on gotcha interviews, but her ability to cover a real wide range, access the information, speak like a human. Man, not many people can do that.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Like we kind of describe Christopher Luxon as gaff prone because he makes gaffes sometimes. Like, well, he's probably basically just like a normal politician. The problem is the archetype is now Jacinda Ardern. It's unimaginable she would ever make a gaff. That's why the arrogant prick was just like, what? She did something like, and that was what we should have known. She was resigning then because it's like a single crack had come.
And speaking of gaffes, one of the gaffes that she committed were ones that she said before she became anywhere near like Prime Minister, like calling Boris Johnson the gaff man. People were sort of just kind of mining through her ancient tweets in order to find her.
I have to say,
prehistoric.
For all the thesis of her as this kind of master of social media, she was a bad tweeter.
Very bad tweeter.
And I think it's because it was just like, she just did the tweets that you're supposed to do, but they just weren't in her. You could just tell that she was like, I suppose I have to write this stupid take.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I mean, the other thing about her, all of that empathy and command and the way she looked and spoke and so on, was that the international media were real into that, and she became this kind of anti-Trump figurehead in many ways, which was a huge asset to her for a while until it became a real negative. To what extent was that sort of international media reaction like a crucial kind of indicator for the electorate's relationship with her, but also for the way that local media kind of had to watch some of that happening a bit jealously at times?
Yeah, I mean, she's had more international attention than any New Zealand leader ever, and probably forever. And it is that thing where, like, in any regular time, international media paying attention to New Zealand for good reasons because of their Prime Minister is like, you should jump on that, absolutely. But there was just so much, and for, maybe Toby can speak to the reasons behind this a bit more, but she was very ran a tight ship locally in terms of allowing access and that sort of thing, which, that potentially that's where that being accessible to the people, I think she has mentioned it or talked about it before, she wanted to be accessible to the people rather than more so than journalists, essentially. It was speak directly to the voters and the people who this affects. And so that's all well and good, but again, it doesn't necessarily need to be an either-or situation. And so then when at times it looked like it was the people and then Vogue, it starts to grate on local media, who, again, it's not like local media's been shut out. Like, there's plenty of... She was there every day at 1 p.m. for a long time. She had a lot of screen time, answered a lot of questions, but there's that kind of that next step of going behind the scenes a little bit, getting that exclusive talk, and instead, those chats happen with international outlet or perhaps Women's Day occasionally if it's going into an election, and so there was certainly a bit of prickliness there.
It was, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it wasn't that long ago that the Prime Minister John Key was paying however many $1,000s to get 90 seconds on David Letterman.
Yeah, that was the thing. We thought it was amazing, but it was partner content.
It was partner content, and probably well worth every dollar spent. So 100%. So no shade there, except that it's quite an unusual problem to face when you're a Prime Minister in a pretty small, mostly irrelevant country at the bottom of the world. Oh no, we've had too many demands for interviews from Vogue, from Time magazine, from the Sunday Times, an unusual thing. And the level of, it'd be interesting at some point, Interesting. At some point, Andrew Campbell and the others in the media team will be able to talk probably about some of that absolute deluge of bids that they got over those years. And I, at the time, was in certain times was writing for an overseas title, so I was sort of on both sides of the fence for a while. But there was certainly a point at which I think it was recognised that the local outlets felt pissed off, probably with some reason, that there she was appearing on all these glossy overseas channels and pages of magazines, and they wanted a sit down too, because it's true that, you know, fronting a lot, but it is different to have a proper sit down. And when you're a political journalist, that's what you want. You want to have a bit of time with the most important person in the country, and I think they recognised that, and so that did turn after a period of time, and then it's interesting. I'm sure you got lots of these, Mad, but for a time there, I would get every week some journalist at an outlet overseas going, I don't know if you could help me. I'm really trying hard to get some time with Jacinda Ardern for a piece on how Jacinda Ardern is the greatest thing in the history of all time. You know, did you get lots of those?
I did, and then my answer was always like, the only response I've ever got are Instagram DMs. Like, that's ironically all bumping into her at a cafe or at the supermarket because she shopped at the same countdown as I did.
Yeah, it's just, if you really, really want it, go to Kind or Crave and sit there long enough. You'll get your moment. Just sort of, I mean, a version of that was her decision, you know, which I think was like quite an interesting one, to quit the weekly ZB slots. And the stated reason for that was to give other outlets some access to her. There was also an undercurrent that Hosking had gotten maybe a bit too sort of maniacal with his style and tone with her. And in terms of that thesis of her as just kind of, she shies away from any kind of hard questions, that was a big plot point to it. To what extent do you think that was a fair criticism, or it was just, you know, it kind of is like fair for a Prime Minister to decide where they go?
I think it was a mistake. I mean, I think just the size of Hosking's audience, absolutely, he had begun to editorialise ever more, you know, both during the interview but also on either side of the interview, saying some pretty toxic things together with his partner and the early edition host Kate Hawkesby. And, you know, I'm not surprised that in PMO you'd be like, fuck this. But sometimes you just have to put a peg on your nose and carry on. I think given his audience, given her ability, you know, to then they will get to the end of the year and exchange gifts, got harder. But I think whether they found a way for it just to be ZB that was dropped, and yes, it was dressed up as we want to do more and different things, but it's like, there were still both breakfast TV channels, which I think you can tell me, Duncan, I think you have quite substantially smaller audiences than the radio. Certainly the ZB.
I mean, it's real. Sorry, this is like real.
This is a media podcast.
This is real deep fold, but because they're measured so differently, one talks about their cumulative weekly audience, and one talks about their momentary audience. That it's very difficult to compare them. But I would guess. If I had to guess, I'd say that radio, particularly ZB and Morning Report, have larger audiences than the breakfast shows at any given time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a mistake.
I think potentially, you know, that was after all of the early COVID stuff, and I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, somebody in the Prime Minister's office, basically during that COVID period, there was certainly a lot of media out there, but everyone was just watching her speak at 1:00 most of the time to get the news. And essentially that's her just cutting out the middleman and saying, oh, I can deliver this news directly, probably better than you could if you cut it up and wrote around it. And so by doing that for that long and it working essentially, like that certainly worked in those early days of the pandemic, it's sort of, I would go, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you go, well, actually this is, you know, we talk for an hour at 1:00 and everyone listens, and now we have to go and put up with Mike Hosking for, you know, 20 minutes or whatever. and just go, well, we'll just go direct, or that's not our audience anyway. So it's probably potentially that sort of we don't need that anymore because we know how to do it ourselves. And ultimately, when you don't have at times, literal captive audience, that's not the case.
It's funny, right? The 1 p.m. briefings, which is probably where I want to kind of conclude this, they were such an extraordinary event, albeit one that felt very natural and necessary at the time, in that you got to watch the news being made in a way that it was completely really unimaginable, especially at scale. A lot of people watching the news being made prior to that. And the interesting thing was that, I spoke to Wayne Wright, who was sort of revealed as the funder of Sean Plunkett's the platform, and it's just become a kind of a vector for the disgruntled people, who said he watched that and saw the, first Jessica, then Toby, as he described it, as evidence of a far too cosy relationship between the media and Ardern. And then there was a whole other group of people who, when she was repeatedly asked a tough question, were like, who are these treasonous people? And it was a single object that resulted in these really wildly different, responses from different segments of the electorate. Looking back on the 1 p.m. briefings, do you think that they ultimately, as popular and necessary as they were for a period of time, that they ultimately, in terms of what they stoked in the electorate and how ultimately they seem to have, for all her brilliance at them, drained the life out of her, or been part of that, how will and should those be remembered as a sort of a political media spectacle? Toby?
It was such a crazy time, wasn't it? I mean, I think if we go back right to the start of that period, the first address was from the Prime Minister's office, and then things moved to the theaterette on the ground floor of the Beehive there. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it certainly felt like we were sort of on a war footing. And both internally, the number of people who, there was sort of a Politburo that was formed of the most senior ministers and officials. There was an all-of-government effort that was established. And the Prime Minister spoke down the barrel directly to the country. And it was necessary, and it worked. And it was incredible, and it was acclaimed the world over. The problem is, how do you then unwind that? How do you return to a level of normalcy, both in terms of your internal structures, but also in terms of the way that you communicate with the public? And it was a conversation that was had with editors when it was happening too. Is like, when do we stop broadcasting this 1 p.m. every day? Because
there's like a political calculus too, right? They were heading into an election, and it was really popular.
It was really popular. The numbers were off the chart, and they were also. There were some pretty unpleasant remarks, some reasonable criticisms made of gallery journalists, but also some pretty unreasonable stuff.
We're talking, of course, about alfresco dining requests from Barry Sofa.
That's right. That whole how the sausage made discussion is quite a boring one, I think. But I think it became a difficulty in terms of how to get back from that incredible time where everyone was running high on adrenaline and the whole machine had to change its shape, and to then kind of to untangle it and get back to normal, I think was the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where it worked going into that 2020 election, but then as basically this extraordinary event where she excels every time started to transition into ordinary New Zealand, where she was less popular, put it that way, then that's when the wheels started to fall off, and suddenly those briefings were not positive watching or not working as they should, because every announcement came with genuine, especially during that Delta lockdown. Suddenly those became very contentious, and actually that was a thing where probably they didn't want to be in front of, not that she was doing all of them then anyway, but suddenly they didn't want to be in front of the cameras all the time, getting all these hard questions, and the beautiful platform that they had built was sort of turning against them. So then that's when suddenly it was once a week, and then online only, and then Ministry of Health website, and it's like, and that would have been equally deliberate, because it's like, well, actually now people don't like hearing from us so much, so let's just slowly back away into the bush.
Yeah, I mean, it does. It's one of those kind of imponderables, like, what might her prime ministership have looked like with different decisions there, or just absent that weight. But it just a really, from a media perspective, I don't imagine that we'll ever see either a prime minister or a dynamic like that one. And thank you both so much for coming on The Fold to chat about it.
Cheers.
The Fold is brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network. It's hosted by Duncan Grieve, with production by Tiahe Butler and Samuel Robinson. Series production is by Jane Yee.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to O Media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Kia ora e te iwi, Tiahe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spin-Off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-Off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-Off Podcast Network.